What if I told you that the woman once billed by Hollywood as the most beautiful woman in the world, a movie star who shared the screen with Clark Gable and Judy Garland, spent her nights in her trailer inventing a secret communications system so advanced that the US Navy initially dismissed it, and that 7 decades later, that same invention would become the technology behind Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS? Her name was Hedy Lamarr. And Hollywood spent 60 years refusing to believe she was as smart as she was beautiful. Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler was born on November 9, 1914, in Vienna, Austria, the only child of a wealthy Jewish banking family. Her father, Emil, was a bank director with a restless intellectual curiosity that he passed directly to his daughter. On long walks through Vienna, he would explain to young Hedy how machines worked, streetcars, printing presses, the inner mechanics of everyday technology. It was, without either of them realizing it, an engineering education disguised as a father-daughter ritual. Her mother, Gertrude, was a concert pianist who introduced Hedy to the arts, but it was clear from an early age that Hedy possessed an unusual combination, a striking, almost otherworldly beauty, paired with a genuinely sharp technical mind. At age 5, she reportedly took apart and reassembled a music box just to understand how it worked. She was the kind of child who was equally fascinated by a piano recital and by the inner workings of a car engine. By her teens, Hedy had discovered acting, and by 16 she was already appearing in Austrian and German films. In 1933, at just 18 years old, she starred in the Czech film Ecstasy, a movie that scandalized international audiences for its brief nude scenes and became instantly, controversially famous, launching her onto the world stage under circumstances she would spend years trying to overcome. In 1933, Hedy married Friedrich Mandl, an enormously wealthy Austrian arms manufacturer with close ties to Mussolini and, increasingly, Hitler's regime. It was a controlling, suffocating marriage. Mandl reportedly kept her virtually a prisoner in their mansion, forcing her to attend his business dinners with military officials and arms designers. But those very dinners, awful as they must have been, gave Hedy something unexpected, a front-row education in military technology, weapons systems, and, crucially, the vulnerabilities of radio-guided torpedoes. In 1937, Hedy did something extraordinary. She drugged her maid, disguised herself in the maid's clothing, and fled the marriage and the country, eventually making her way to London, then to Hollywood, where MGM studio head Louis B. Mayer signed her and rebranded her Hedy Lamarr, marketing her, in his own words, as the most beautiful woman in the world. She became a genuine movie star, appearing alongside Clark Gable in Boomtown, starring in Algiers, and eventually headlining Samson and Delilah in 1949, one of the highest-grossing films of the decade. But behind the glamorous premieres and the studio-manufactured image, Hedy spent her evenings doing something almost nobody in Hollywood knew about. She had a drafting table set up in her house, and she used it. In 1940, Hedy met composer George Antheil at a dinner party, and the two struck up an unlikely partnership. Drawing directly on what she'd overheard at those wartime arms dinners in Austria, Hedy proposed a way to prevent the Axis powers from jamming Allied radio-guided torpedoes, a system where both the transmitter and receiver would rapidly and randomly hop between different radio frequencies in perfect synchronization, making the signal nearly impossible to detect or jam. Antheil, who had experience synchronizing player pianos, helped her design the mechanism using a system inspired by, remarkably, a piano roll. In 1942, they were granted U.S. patent number 2,292,387 for secret communication system, what we now call frequency hopping spread spectrum technology. Hedy offered it to the U.S. Navy for free, as her contribution to the war effort. The Navy, astonishingly, dismissed it, reportedly telling her she'd be more useful to the war effort selling war bonds using her celebrity than inventing weapons technology. She did both anyway, helping raise millions of dollars in war bonds through her film star status while her actual invention sat unused in a government drawer for decades. The Navy's dismissal turned out to be one of the most consequential missed opportunities in technological history, but it wasn't a permanent one. Frequency hopping technology was eventually adopted by the U.S. military, reportedly first used during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, well after Hedy's original 1942 patent had expired, meaning she never earned a cent for military use of her own invention. But the real transformation came decades later. The core principle Hedy and Antheil pioneered, frequency hopping spread spectrum, became foundational to the technology that would define the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It is a direct technical ancestor of Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and GPS, the invisible infrastructure connecting billions of devices on Earth every single second. Every time you connect a wireless speaker, unlock your phone with a nearby smartwatch, or use GPS navigation, you are using a descendant of an invention sketched out by a Hollywood movie star at her kitchen table during World War II. For over 50 years, almost nobody knew. Hollywood had built her entire public identity around her face, and the film industry, and the world, simply could not reconcile the most beautiful woman in the world with the woman who helped invent the technological backbone of the wireless age. It took until 1997, when Hedy was 82 years old, for the Electronic Frontier Foundation to formally recognize her and Anhau with a Pioneer Award for their invention. She was also inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2014, 14 years after her death. Hedy's later Hollywood years grew increasingly difficult. As she aged, the industry that had built its entire relationship with her around physical beauty gradually discarded her, and her film career declined through the 1950s. She married and divorced 6 times in total, struggled financially in her later decades, and became increasingly reclusive, eventually living largely in isolation in Florida, communicating with the world mostly by telephone. In a final cruel irony, Hedy Lamarr, the woman who helped invent frequency-hopping wireless communication, spent her final years almost entirely on the telephone, the very technology her invention would eventually help transform, while the world had largely forgotten who she was. Hedy Lamarr died on January 19, 2000, at her home in Castleberry, Florida, at the age of 85. Per her final wishes, her ashes were scattered in the Vienna woods of her native Austria, a quiet return home for a woman whose extraordinary mind had been overlooked by the world for most of her life. Hedy Lamarr once said, "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." It was a joke rooted in decades of quiet fury, the fury of a woman with one of the sharpest technical minds of her generation, forced to spend her entire public life pretending she was only a face. She helped invent the technology that connects the modern world, and for most of her life, almost nobody believed she could have. Her story isn't just about her forgotten invention. It's about how easily the world decides what a person is allowed to be brilliant at. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Who do you want to see next?